Good morning. I'm Richard Ponsford and I work as the Executive Officer for Western Melbourne Tourism. On behalf of the Chair, our Chair, Jan Jacklin, and the Board of Western Melbourne Tourism and the School for the Visitor Economy at Victoria University, I welcome you to the first forum in this new series, Conversations on Recovery. Isn't this timing great with the announcements over the last 48 hours of the easing of restrictions? Hooray! There is some light and it's a hopeful turning point in our journey along this pathway to recovery ahead of us. The series will continue in a partnership with the university with further forums this year and into next year. Our ambition is to provide insights and information about the recovery of our visitor economy with a particular focus on Melbourne's West and making use of this really efficient Zoom mode. So today's forum will focus on the economic outlook. We have around 120 people registered for the forum with a great cross-section of representation across businesses, the local visitor sector, government and councils, university, and it's particularly pleasing to see so many students on this list as well. So before we start, just some technical housekeeping. Apart from our panelists, cameras and microphones are switched off. But you are encouraged to post any questions or comments in the Q&A chat. This forum is being recorded and will be available after the session, as well as the PowerPoint slides. So I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors, elders and families of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the Victoria University land, and acknowledge the unique role the Kulin people's living culture plays in the life of our region. We also acknowledge all traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and pay our respect to their culture and their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Joanne Pike, who is the Director of the School for the Visitor Economy at Victoria University and partner in the delivery of this forum series. Jo will be our moderator of the questions and will be on screen later in the forum to facilitate discussion with our presenter, Karl Flowers. Questions have been coming in thick and fast already through the registration process. We encourage you to ask questions through the forum and all the panelists can see these as they come in. So to our guest presenter today, Karl Flowers. Karl is a leading tourism economist who has spent the last 6 months forecasting the pathway of recovery from the COVID pandemic for nearly 20 Australian and overseas destinations. He was previously the Chief Economist at Tourism Australia and Director of Investment in the Commonwealth Department of Tourism. So in June this year, he completed a review of the forecast recovery of Melbourne's West tourism region, and it's embracing its 6 local government areas from COVID-19 and looked at that in 2 scenarios. And we had a more optimistic and a more pessimistic scenario. And unfortunately, I think we're probably heading down the more pessimistic path from things that have happened. So it's been a tale of 2 cities over the last 12 months. Up until March, we had a region experiencing significant trajectory of growth, and then COVID arrived and haven't our perspectives changed. So Karl will be discussing the current and predicted economic landscape, the scope of COVID-19 impacts on the sector, as well as offering some constructive information and recommendations on how Melbourne's West can accelerate recovery. Over to Karl.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon to all. Thank you to Melbourne's West Tourism and the School for the Visitor Economy at Victoria University for this opportunity to brief you on the research I've been doing. If you ask me about the mood of this presentation, I would say the overall vibe of the presentation is very nervous, short term, with longer term optimism. I'm very nervous in the short term because the local visitor economy is far from out of the COVID woods as yet. Optimistic in the longer term because once we have the vaccine, the visitor economy for Melbourne and its west are looking far better than they might have on market share terms, even in 2019. I'll be going through slides fairly quickly, but don't worry, that's to give some time for questions. And also thank you for those that provided questions in advance, because that helped tailor this presentation to address a number of those questions as we go through. You'll be sent the slides after the presentation, so you'll have the opportunity to look through them yourself at your leisure. It is a horrible year for tourism in Melbourne and Melbourne's west. And as with the situation with the 10 Commandments, not all of the 10 Commandments were particularly popular. And a number of the aspects of this presentation will be also quite difficult. My nervousness mostly surrounds this financial year, 2020-21. But as I said earlier, I've got some optimism, and some of those reasons for the optimism are shown here. Certainly better than key destinations overseas. I think the vaccine progress has been a bit faster. And I think the Victorian success most recently is all very important. But a key takeout from this presentation is that compared to overseas, we are doing fantastically. The global tourism industry situation is dire. McKinsey and Company did a major review right around the world on global tourism impacts, and they called the review "The Industry Turned Upside Down." One of the reasons Melbourne's West is better off is that the JobKeeper program and other emergency government assistance, including from the state government. And the second reason is that there's just less virus in Australia. But globally, the tourism industry is collapsing. And the light in the tunnel is from 2024. And it doesn't look like it's going to be sooner for global tourism. One of the things there's been a lot of discussion about is, should we close down, etc. The evidence is very clear that controlling the virus is the best way to improve the economy overall. And also, what this presentation talks to you about is it's the best way to improve the visitor economy's prospects. Because when we look at the USA, we see what happens to the visitor economy when the virus is horribly mismanaged. The lesson from the USA is that you can't run visitor economy businesses at 50% of capacity. Until social distancing rules are eased, restaurants without JobKeeper can't survive. Two numbers for you. I want you to see if you can remember them. One is 1,727 and the other is 35. 1,727 is the number of deaths from COVID in New York City per million people. 35 is the number of deaths from COVID in Australia per million people. 50, yes, 50 times worse. I'll give you a moment to read this slide because it's quite important in the next few months for Melbourne's West. I ask you to give silent thanks. You are not in the visitor economy in the USA. The worst, amen, the worst virus infection rates in the world are in New York, New Jersey, and they're at 12 times the world average. Victoria's active cases have halved in the last 2 days. Huge progress. But in the Northern Hemisphere, winter is coming. And in the 10 previous flu epidemics, US scientists have found that the second wave was a much higher peak than the first wave. And in this case, it will coincide with winter. So that makes eliminating the virus in Australia all the more valuable, including to the visitor economy. Something surprising to think about is that Victoria and Melbourne are going to look like, and Melbourne in particular, is going to look like the world's most livable city, much faster than most of us could believe. But this will largely because the competitive cities will have gone backwards. We've got data from the June quarter of 2020 for tourism, and the Victorian tourism visitor economy, 85% stopped. And we know that in the third quarter, it got worse. But Australian policymakers, including in local government, have been very slow to understand that the COVID recession in Australia is very largely, not completely, but very largely, the visitor economy recession. This slide might be the most important I will show you. This is job losses measured on the Australian Tax Office's single touch payroll system. So it excludes some small business which might be more affected. The two big parts of the visitor economy in Victoria had near 30% falls in employment from 14th of March to 3 October. But in looking at this slide, remember that this real situation is much worse. Of course, many more jobs than even these 30% were protected by JobKeeper. At a local level, the ABS now produces some wonderful estimates of job losses at an SA3 level. Not the most cheerful reading, but you can actually look up something which matches quite closely to the local government areas in Melbourne's west. So this is a key resource I suggest you monitor as we go forward. But as shown in the right column, between 40 and 50% of all businesses in the area were in the first 6 months of JobKeeper, they were on it. And this saved many, many jobs. So as the cartoon shows, we've had the first punch already hit in terms of close down and social distancing, March to November. And now we're about to begin the second hit, and that's the phase out of JobKeeper, another relief. We have actuaries, the actuaries Taylor Fry to thank for giving us this second column of data, and their comments on releasing it should be heard right across Australia. Just give you a second to read the caption for our little man. But unfortunately, these comments and the earlier slide on the concentration of job losses in the visitor economy, 3 times worse than the economy overall, seem to have been lost on the way to the last federal budget. I think you can probably guess which industry sectors were the big winners from economic stimulus 3 weeks ago in the federal budget. The Grattan Institute concluded that the federal government economic stimulus ignores hardest hit industries and is more a blue budget than a pink budget. When in fact, the worry is, as we go forward with further job losses in the visitor economy, that there's going to be many more job losses amongst women than amongst men going forward. And yet the economic stimulus was in construction, utilities, energy, and manufacturing. The next slide is probably the second most important. What happens when the JobKeeper parachute and the other forms of assistance used by the visitor economy to slow its descent disappear? So we're in a parachute as the visitor economy heading towards Earth, and the parachute above us is about to start disintegrating. What happens when the parachute fails when we're halfway down to the ground. The visitor economy is going to hit the ground very hard in a second and larger wave of business collapses in the next 9 months. And that's what I meant by that cartoon where you have the first punch of the close down that we've gone through and the second punch of the withdrawal of the emergency support. Thank goodness for the emergency support. Otherwise, unemployment would be perhaps 16% across Australia. Melbourne's West is an unusual tourism region. It's unusual, it's very high population, it's got a diversified industry base compared to most regional areas of the state, and as a result, it has a smaller share of reliance on the visitor economy. The average for Melbourne's West is that visitor spending provides, in total, direct and indirect, about 3/4 direct, 4.2% of overall employment across the 6 local government areas. But in the research I did that Richard commissioned, what I found was that it varies quite a bit, between 2 and 6% across Melbourne's West. The most visitor economy focused area is Wyndham at 5.8% of area jobs, and the least is the Brimbank city at 2.4% of local jobs, due to, as I say, the total impacts. But that's looking at where people work. And that's only one side of the story. Many more residents of Melbourne's West work in the visitor economy elsewhere in Melbourne. And increasing unemployment in the visitor economy across Melbourne is going to reduce the economic activity in your region. In the 2016 census, 9% of jobs held by residents of the 6 Western Melbourne LGAs, so roughly twice the number of jobs in the LGAs, were in either accommodation and food services and arts and recreation services, the 2 visitor economy sectors worst affected by the COVID visitor economy recession. But when you look at an average of 4.2% across the region, and you compare that with 46% at Daylesford, 35% on Phillip Island, and 20% plus in Victoria's High Country and East Gippsland, these other areas are going to be in regional depression. So on that basis, having a lower reliance on the visitor economy because of a more diversified economy is a plus. As I said, there are differences between regions in how reliant they are on employment, most obviously between Daylesford and Melbourne's West. And what influences that? Well, there's quite a lot of modelling behind that in terms of the big differences are what type of visitors come and what their purpose of visit is. Obviously, if you're in an area which is highly reliant on, or has less reliance rather, on international and interstate visitors, and more reliance on domestic day trip and domestic VFR visitor nights, you'll be less affected by the COVID. The visitor economy will be less affected. Think of Ballarat, which is the area that I found had the least decline in the visitor economy in 2021. Alternatively, if you have a high level of international or interstate and low levels of domestic day trips and domestic VFR nights, you are more hit by the COVID visitor economy recession. And you can think of the city of Melbourne, which is the worst affected area of the country. This table, we won't have time to go through it now, but it shows that overall Melbourne's West is highly dependent on international visitor nights for nearly half of the visitor spending in your region. Domestic day trips are thankfully a little above the state average, so that helps. The other thing that's behind this data is that you have in your region very high shares of visiting friends and relatives. and that will be the least affected purpose of visit. So the next slide shows the forecasts under the two scenarios that Richard mentioned. By local government area, by Melbourne's West region, and showing in comparison to the Melbourne tourism region, to which you're very similar, and the City of Melbourne, to which you're much better. So the good news scenario is scenario 1, and that shows a loss of only 30 to 45% in visitor spending in 2021, before the assumed arrival of a vaccine in April 2021, which means that by 2022-23, your region has a full recovery to go slightly past your 2019 levels. The bad news scenario, scenario 2, is not as happy. Since I did the forecast in June, for 2020-21, scenario 2 is much more likely. But thankfully, the good news with vaccine developments means that 22-23 is much more likely to be scenario 1. And that's certainly helped by the elimination of the virus pretty much across Australia. When I convert those visitor spending numbers to job losses, and when I looked at 20 regions over 10 years, the correlation between visitor spending and job losses is almost 1-to-1. But the job losses are obviously delayed. And by the July next year, these are the sort of job losses I'd be expecting across the local government areas, just due to falling visitor economy spending. So that'll be partly in accommodation, partly in food services, partly in retail, but also in the range of businesses that are affected by less visitor spending. And there will be many of those. Obviously, international education is a key one. Some people in the commentators, often people who are economic commentators not used to looking at tourism, have been spreading a myth. And that myth is that we don't have anything to worry about once we eliminate the virus, because domestic tourism is going to boom because people can't go outbound. I'm here to tell you that myth is absolute rubbish. It's a very dangerous myth. The forecasts in the table were done by the official government forecaster for domestic tourism only. And what those forecasts show is that domestic tourism, and these were done in June, and they didn't allow for closure of state borders. They didn't allow for the second wave in Melbourne. So if they were being done now, they would be considerably worse than what we have here. And we know that Victoria is going to be worse than national averages. The fact is that around 70% of outbound tourism is things like gap years, what I call fly and flop tourism, and travel by senior Australians, which doesn't readily divert to domestic tourism. So there's not going to be a very strong substitution of outbound to domestic, and we need to recognise that in our planning. I mentioned international education, and this chart shows that the international education problems are only continuing to build. And not just because the federal government is going out of its way not to help universities. As more students finish their degrees, fees from students will continue to fall as borders stay closed. And that's going to have a longer lasting impact on university finances. As well, the failures we've seen in hotel quarantine and continuing infections that we see in the arrivals that are coming, including returned Australians, mean that no government wants to risk bringing in foreign students through quarantine. And Victoria's government, least of all, given recent experiences. So, how do we think the visitor economy recovery will occur? What are its features? This slide, I think, warrants a fair bit of study. Certainly some parts of the visitor economy will rebound faster. But the sectors that will rebound faster tend to be focused on weekends. So we're going to have busier weekends and slower weekdays. And that's a problem for a lot of businesses because their costs are higher on weekends. The fastest recovering sectors are domestic day trips and intrastate visiting friends and relatives. There's going to be a lot less domestic holiday travel. A lot of people in Victoria have nightmares, ongoing nightmares about homeschooling. The idea of 4 weeks with the kids on the traditional Christmas, January school holiday trip is something that most won't contemplate. The other thing is that travel is discretionary spending. And when we see unemployment increasing again, as we're in a very strong recession, the Reserve Bank is talking about 10 years before unemployment comes back to its former level. In a recession, discretionary spending is the first thing cut. Business travel will also be much slower than even leisure travel to recover. That was true of previous recessions. The businesses cut travel expenditure, but they're going to do it with added zoom this time. We're also going to see higher domestic airfares. We've already seen Virgin cut their fleet of aircraft considerably, and Qantas, their competitive position as a quasi-monopolist is only going to be stronger. So we're going to see higher airfares. There'll be less heavily discounted air tickets available once borders are open a while. The other thing is that Australia's virus suppression means that we will be waiting longer before we get international visitors. Visitors may not be allowed until they've got proof of vaccination. So my key message is to be very nervous short term and really monitoring the economic situation, those unemployment data from the ABS that I mentioned to you, but much more optimistic long term. You can see from this slide that you can take Newcastle out of the buoy, but it's a bit harder to take. Melbourne's west is better off than most Victorian LGAs in terms of the overall economy, but worse off in its visitor economy. And that's because of the high share of international spending. Please don't confuse falls in Victorian daily infections with rapid economic recovery. We're only halfway down the declines in the visitor economy now because of the very effective economic emergency support. What's going to happen is JobKeeper comes off, the moratorium on rents, moratorium on repaying loans comes off, and most importantly, the moratorium on bankruptcies comes off. So far, the increase in unemployment has been heavily, heavily disguised. You need to look through that disguise to see where the real economy is. One of the things I haven't mentioned is the fallout for the construction sector, which is a big part of your regional economy. And with lower immigration, that's going to squeeze a lot of business activity in the outer suburban areas. And that's going to mean that prices are going to fall in those areas a little bit too. And that's going to be a further squeeze on your economy. What I want to do now is talk about the worthwhile initiatives. And this is coming up to my last slide. What are the worthwhile initiatives now that we should be doing? Well, ideally, the federal government will see sense and recognise that the visitor economy is the heart of the COVID recession in Australia. We need to extend JobKeeper beyond March 2021 for this sector, and we need to bring forward not just that emergency assistance of JobKeeper, but economic stimulus for the visitor economy. because it is by far the hardest hit sector. That message has to sink in. And I urge all of you to take that message around the country as much as you can. Travel bubbles for international from selected countries can be a lifeline for us if we keep the virus eliminated. The obvious travel bubble countries are New Zealand, but New Zealand on its own will only make the visitor economy worse in Melbourne, not better, because so many more Australians go outbound to New Zealand than New Zealanders come to Australia. So New Zealand, a travel bubble, but also Japan, Taiwan, who's done an amazing job, South Korea, Singapore perhaps, and ideally, despite diplomatic horrors, China. The role of the state government will continue to be really important, particularly for smaller businesses. Those grants that small business have been receiving from state government have been lifesavers in many cases for small businesses and the visitor economy. Local governments, and I know we have some in the room, can help with regulatory flexibility for outdoor hospitality and a commitment to boost local events as soon as it is safe to do so. Ideally, local governments will band together to brand Melbourne's West around key attractions and a theme of Australia's best multicultural food and events. Because I think that is the logical place for Melbourne's West to go forward. And as with all crises, don't waste the crises in terms of getting an opportunity to deliver worthwhile long-term reforms. For those people in the audience who are in universities now, it is a really, really good time for increasing your skills. Business management skills will be given much more importance in the visitor economy, and policymakers will need much greater expertise in the visitor economy than they have ever acknowledged in the past. The lack of international students and working holiday makers in the short term will make finding a part-time job slightly easier as the visitor economy begins to recover, but it won't be terribly easy. Overall, there will be a much greater focus on financial and professional business management in the visitor economy from the COVID recession. This will help bring a much better performing and more profitable sector in the long term. Australia is on the crest after COVID of having a much enhanced reputation in the world, particularly for the sectors of international education, where our major competitors are the USA and the UK, both of which have made a complete mess of COVID. If you're a parent in an Asian or other country thinking about somewhere safe to send your children to university, we are gaining ground, even without students here. So that closes the presentation. I've run through a number of the questions where we're going to have that you provided beforehand, but I'll now pass to Joanne to take charge of the Q&A and to lead that.
Terrific. Thank you, Karl. That was really, really interesting. Not always happy news, but gave us lots of insights about the impacts of what we've just been through. And I suppose your initial slides made me feel proud to be Victorian. We've done the hard work and we'll benefit from that, and we can celebrate a little bit. And we've set ourselves up for going forward. But you've touched on a lot of things here that I thought I might just ask you to elaborate on that came from people's questions. But I suppose the first one is one of my own questions. You spoke a lot about the centrality of the visitor economy in overall economic impacts and economic recovery, and suggesting that government hasn't really fully realised just how important visitor economy is. What can we do to highlight that? I mean, it's something within the industry that we talk about a lot, but it seems that the focus, and certainly the federal government stimulus package reflected this, was a lot of support for industries like construction, but not a lot of consideration for visitor economy. How do we address that?
The federal government's been remarkably resistant on this point. Thankfully, their emergency assistance has given us the opportunity to look what is happening around the world where that emergency assistance isn't available to the visitor economy. And if we look at international airlines, for example, they have gone through hell and now they're going to the next level of hell because they've survived so far with cash injections, not flying, keeping people's payments, but now the time is running out. And so what we're going to see is dramatic stimulus in, I think, whatever administration we see in the US, very much targeted to the visitor economy. What I think will also happen, and it doesn't give me any pleasure to say this, is that the federal government's budget strategy will have been shown to fail by about March next year. Won't be a part fail, it'll be a complete fail. And the reason is that the stimulus they injected, such as tax cuts, etc., will be largely saved because about 88% of the tax cuts after the first year go to the wealthy, who will save them. And the tax cuts for the working class aren't available until they complete this financial year's tax refund. So as a result, we're not going to see the economic stimulus. As JobKeeper comes off, if you look at that chart that I showed you from, that shows the decline in the support, I think the support falls something like 3/4 in the fourth quarter, and then half in the first quarter, and then disappears. And we're talking about something like 12% of GDP. That has been a huge saviour, but as that disappears, the government are going to suddenly see unemployment shooting up. It may not happen much till April, but I think next winter is going to be horrendous. And next winter will be the last winter before a federal election. And we all realise the wonderful focusing power of a federal election on freeing the budget process. I'm expecting a mini budget in probably March. And I think that will have more economic stimulus. If they wanted to do something quickly, I'd be encouraging them to have vouchers for domestic tourism, for Sunday to Thursday night accommodation, where you stay 2 nights, you get a $100 voucher.
Okay.
And I think that would stimulate a lot of domestic travel and at least people thinking more about staying midweek, because I think going forward, the Friday and Saturday nights will continue to be fine. And that seasonality problem, because the internationals were an even flow through the week, that disguised some of the very strong within week seasonality, which kills business. Thanks, Joanne.
Okay. No, well, that's interesting that that idea about vouchers. I was just interested in if there's any other suggestions that could help stimulate the hospitality sector, as you mentioned before. I mean, we had the example from the UK with the 10 quid meals that Boris encouraged everybody to go out and eat their way to recovery. Are there other, I know my daughter living in London is regretting the decision at the moment. Are there any other ideas that you might suggest to stimulate the economy?
The hospitality sector, to some extent, the people doing takeaway and having JobKeeper, they've often never had a better year financially.
Mm.
Don't tell everyone, but that's the case. The people in the nighttime economy have been devastated.
Okay.
And so if we're going to do things in hospitality, a lot of them are around helping businesses with social distancing and reducing the social distancing as fast as we can. And also working on more general nighttime economy initiatives, because that's the part of the visitor economy in hospitality that's borne the greatest costs. But there are things that local government, and this is where local government can be very important with some of the regulations around outside dining, etc. And I really encourage them to throw away the rule book. And there's a lot of officials in local government who that's very worrying for. And so we really need them. We need some, if Victoria University wanted to do some research at the moment that would make a real difference, I'd look at some best case study models of local governments who are doing it well and what that's made a difference to the businesses.
Okay.
Because I think it's huge, and with 8 square metres per person, the only reason restaurants are opening is because they can't do their accounting.
Mm.
In the main, it's, if they actually could do the cost accounting on it,
Okay.
we'd be eating takeaway for a lot longer still.
Yeah. Okay. And we would like to go to a restaurant, so let's hope we can. I hope we can get a booking in the next week or so. We've just had a question come in on the chat, which is on a slightly different track. But the question is, do you think it's a good opportunity for tourism in Melbourne's West to go green and carbon neutral? Do you have any suggestions about this? Can we take the crisis opportunity to build a new image for our tourism destinations? And I think that's a really interesting question, because one of the things that are coming up through the literature is about the social contract for tourism. And so we have lots of regions at the moment where we've got a backlash from communities about tourism. So do you have any responses to that?
I'd probably take the counter view, and as an economist, it mightn't surprise you. But many of our small and medium-sized visitor economy businesses have never been in as much financial challenge. Their pure focus is on deferring bank repayments, keeping the rent at the reduced level. And a lot of them are very upset about the extension of stage 4 as long as it's gone.
Mm.
So to take to them a green agenda at the moment, I think would be physically risky to the people involved. I think there are things that are essential in terms of improving the sustainability and reducing energy use. And hopefully some businesses in this period have used it to work on their business, given that they couldn't work in their business. And some of that may have been installing solar power. Some of it may have been looking at their energy bills. And so I think there's going to be, across the board, a focus on reducing costs. And so that, I think, will have some green implications. In the regional areas, there is a real challenge in making Melburnians in particular welcome, because JobKeeper has disguised the true horrors of unemployment that would have happened in those regional areas. So the locals have said, our economy is okay, people are spending money, people are reasonably happy, forgetting that most of it's coming from the government. And we've really enjoyed no one on our beach, our walking track, our national park. For goodness sake, let's learn from this crisis. Let's ban all tourists. And that's one of the key challenges for all regional tourism organisations, and I'd argue state governments and local governments in those areas, is to look through the protections that exist to what the real underlying problem is and get that understood in the community. Because there will be a lot of communities that won't want tourism back. For Melbourne's West, as a visiting friends and relatives destination, one of the most important things to do is to encourage people to invite their friends and relatives. And when they get them there, get them to come into Melbourne's West, then get them to go to Werribee Zoo, to go to the other attractions in Williamstown, etc. And anything those businesses can do that gives a local who brings 2 visitors from outside the area, give that local a free ticket if they can bring 2 others. Just encourage the locals to show these attractions and get some revenue into those attractions. So there are things that can be done, but I'd be remarkably pessimistic about, and I'd be nervous about taking a green agenda out there beyond looking at some help with cost saving.
Okay. I guess everything you're suggesting is the need for some very nuanced policy making, and if we want green, we need to tie that into stimulus measures. And you started, you touched on this in various ways, and you're just talking about it. But one of the things I wanted to ask was about, I mean, you've talked about Melbourne's West as being unique and in some ways well positioned compared to a lot of other regions. So, and you've suggested a few priorities for the West. So that's in attractions, nighttime economy. You've also, I mean, maybe you could elaborate a bit on the role of festivals and events. What kind of festivals and events, and how quickly should we start building those up?
The ideal festival and event is one that is completely aligned with the brand of the area. So if the brand of the area of Melbourne's West is what makes Melbourne's West unique, I would argue it is multicultural food, multicultural success and variation, and multicultural festivals. Now, a lot of local governments might say, and state government might say, well, you can't run events at the moment, so forget about events. My view is that that's true, but what you need to be doing is planning events as soon as they're safe to run and redesigning them often so that they are safer to run, and then putting more money into events rather than less. Because events are how you build your brand in an area like Melbourne's West. It's not going to be an advertising blitz. It's not going to be visiting journalists particularly, although you can do a little bit of that. It's really about getting people to come to something as an event. And so I'd be looking to beef up the events budget, make bigger commitments, because I think that's a key way to get people visiting, getting friends and relatives to come into the area. I still come back to the idea that without internationals, Melbourne's West is going to struggle in terms of visitor spending. We're looking at about a 50% fall this year. But we can do more once we eliminate the virus, which we hopefully have. We can do so much more in the event space. So, but for goodness sake, make the events meaningful in terms of the brand. So balloon festivals, all the various other things, you know, probably wine festivals, probably aren't that relevant to Melbourne's West. What's relevant to Melbourne's West? What is aligned with the brand that Melbourne West has? And if Melbourne West can get a reputation as the best hosts of friends and relatives, and so the operators work with the residents to make that a reality, then I think Melbourne's West tourism can grow very strongly indeed.
I like that theme. A reputation as the best hosts. That's an aspirational message, I think. We've just had another question come through on the chat. What opportunities might there be for vertical or virtual reality? Not quite sure what the question is getting at.
Well, virtual reality is becoming very important at the moment. I'm currently doing work in Rwanda. It just doesn't look like it, on religious tourism. And virtual reality is a way that you can enrich attractions at much lower cost than we've ever had. Stonehenge is a fascinating case study where the British government spent something like £40 million upgrading the visitor attraction with virtual reality and various other things. So virtual reality is part of the new tourism. It will replace labour, but it will enrich the experience, and that's what is most important in our social media-led world.
That's perhaps a segue again. You did talk about job losses and gave some advice to people who are trying to build careers in this area. So, and this is particularly relevant to our students, I suppose. But how optimistic should they feel about a career in tourism, hospitality and events? And what would you do to position yourself successfully along the career path in the field?
The recognition for the visitor economy has a rocket at the moment in policymakers, with policymakers and with government levels more generally. That attention is going to mean that and in the private sector in the visitor economy, there's much greater focus on getting the business to work better. A lot of these businesses have used the close down, as I say, to work on the business. And that's involved consideration of a whole range of small but important innovations in the way they deliver. So a student with the right background, and I'd say the right background, it pains me to say this as an economist, but accounting has never been sexier. And the old joke is that economists didn't have the charisma to be accountants. Then you come back to the idea that it's going to be more of a business focus going forward. So those business aspects of the qualifications are particularly relevant to getting in the door. One of the things without working holiday makers here with fewer international students is that domestic students are going to find increased opportunities in a recessed economy to take places. And those businesses that do survive are going to be more profitable because a lot of their competition is going to disappear. And that, I think, to some extent, it's very Darwinian, but we are looking at a quantum jump in the improvement of business management in the visitor economy. We just achieved it in not the way we would like. And so in that improvement, those businesses are going to be looking for innovation, looking for fresh skills. So I think it is reasonably positive, but more particularly, Australia's outstanding performance in combating the virus. And a lot of people are going to be talking about Victoria as the place which got rid of the biggest second wave best. Now, a lot of people won't like that, but it's the way of the world. Then the longer term outlook for graduates, I think, is particularly healthy. I guess if I was a graduate, I'd probably prefer to be in first year now than finishing in November. But I think the longer term outlook is really strong.
That's great. Thank you for encouraging our students, given the dismal news. And I think to draw some threads together, I think that possibly there's lots of opportunities for employment in Melbourne West as well, given where we've got room for development and growth. And so, the next few years could be really exciting.
I think one of the other things that Melbourne's West has as a big opportunity is that the problems in the city of Melbourne and those buildings in Docklands that house 6,000 people in a single office building, some people have christened the land-based equivalent of a cruise ship. There's going to be a bit of a backlash, and working from home, I think there's going to be a bit of a decentralisation of the nighttime economy, but also of office work. Yeah. So if you're in a business, will you put all your eggs in the City of Melbourne basket, or will you move some office accommodation to Melbourne's West on the basis that it gives people a different opportunity? And I think we're going to see a lot of growth in small offices for large organisations that they can use periodically, bring team together in small numbers safely. And economically, you can't build those in the City of Melbourne. And Melbourne's West has a bit of an opportunity, as do places like City of Stonington, which have also done work for.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have another question come through on chat. Do you see any hopes of Australia opening up to international students and visiting families with perhaps rapid testing or some initiatives around quarantine? But having asked that, Karl, I just know we've only got a few minutes to go. So
probably no is the short answer, because I'm also looking at the time and thinking we've got a couple of minutes, but unfortunately not, particularly in Victoria. If they were in another state, they'd have some better chance, but it's really very, very difficult after the experience here with quarantine.
Okay. Well, we might wrap it up now, Karl. I personally find your presentation fascinating. I think anyone who has been forecasting in the last 6 months is a very brave person. Given that everything that any plans have gone out the window this year, and planning has been a very tentative enterprise. But so thank you for those insights and the evidence that underpin it, because it's really important for us to move forward. And we're hopefully at a stage where we can have some clear insights on which to base policies and get ideas about how to move through this in the best way possible and as quickly as possible. So I actually feel quite optimistic after this conversation, particularly for Melbourne's West. I think the future will be rocky, but exciting. But so on that note, I'd like to thank you. That was really good. Also like to thank Richard and Western Melbourne Tourism for being partners on this project. We work a lot together, and it's incredibly valuable. So from the school's perspective, one of our big objectives is to create the bridges between students at the university and industry and community. So these events are very important for that. If you still have questions, get in touch with Richard or myself. As we mentioned, the slides will be available and you'll get a follow-up email from this. You can also visit our web pages where the information will be posted. So thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing you all at our next Conversations for Recovery in the next few weeks. Okay, thank you.